Hola mi familia, ¿qué tal? So today I wanted to talk to you guys about a character very near and dear to me. I'm talking about Marvel's Batman. I mean Lunar Legionnaire. The Fist of Khonshu himself, Moon Knight. So this video is going to be part educational, part video essay, and part my own personal journey with the character. So Moon Knight isn't one of Marvel's better known characters. He's far from Marvel's holy grail that is Spider-Man. He's not on the level of an Iron Man, Thor, Hulk, or X-Men for that matter. And I mean all that in terms of powers and popularity. He's always been this sort of niche character to some of even the most well-versed comic book readers. I know I made the joke earlier, but a quick skim through his wiki page and some people would write him off as Marvel's Batman. But the man known as Mark Spector, Stephen Grant, Jake Lockley, and Mr. Knight is much more than that. So, I was introduced to Moon Knight when I was really little. When I was a kid, one of my favorite things to do was to go through my dad's comic book collection. He hated when I did that because I always left a mess and never put anything back where it belonged. But my dad had been collecting comic books since he was a kid in the 70s, and as a 90s kid, it was like looking into a time capsule. My dad had like everything from old Superman comics, Green Lantern and Green Arrow team-ups, X-Men, Wolverine, Punisher, Daredevil, you name it. And I would be remiss to say that my dad is basically a walking Batman encyclopedia. And to him I say, this is a Nightwing Stan channel. But getting back on track, what I was really obsessed with going through his collection was his old prints of Spider-Man in his first run in the black symbiote costume. I was so obsessed with symbiote Spider-Man. If I was writing Spider-Man, he would stay in the black costume. But that's why I probably won't ever be chosen to write Spider-Man. Now, in going through his collection sometimes, I would see this guy in a white hood with wrappings around him in a cape, and he would have like Egyptian motif armor on him sometimes. You'd see him fighting a werewolf occasionally. And I couldn't care less about who that character was. Until my dad grabbed me and sat me down and said, listen here, you little fuck. Let me just say the passion my dad had in his voice talking about this character was really infectious to me. I became so interested, I had to know more. But fast forward, I wouldn't really seek out the character on my own until my teenage years. It was around the age of 13 or 14 that he started allowing me to read much more mature comic books. And the first character that I had to get my hands on was not Moon Knight. Everyone who knows me knows how big of a Spawn fan that I am. I'm not getting off track. This video isn't about the demonic entity with the best cape in all of comics. While I still read Spawn to this day, at that time, Spawn was merely a gateway into the darker, much more edgier stories that my teenage hormonal brain was looking for. So one day at Barnes & Noble, I'm going back and forth between the graphic novel and the manga section, and I saw it. It was a trade paperback of Moon Knight: The Bottom. That's not really a great way to sell you guys this character, is it? This was my first independent dive into this character, and Moon Knight: The Bottom was honestly an accurate title for the character at the time. The series was written by Charlie Huston at the time, who would go on to write and produce for Fox's Gotham series. And the first 8 issues were illustrated by god-tier artist David Finch. I'll elaborate more on him later. The story shows Moon Knight, aka Mark Spector, at his lowest. After a battle with his longtime foe mercenary Raoul Bushman, a battle that saw him ripping off the former's face and holding it up to the moon, he suffered injuries that would leave him unable to continue his crusade of vengeance and as a protector of those travelers in the night. He would ultimately become a shell of himself, relying on alcohol and painkillers, pushing away his longtime lover Marlene and a lot of his other close friends. At this time, his god and benefactor Khonshu was all but silent to him in his prayers. I would say the story itself is okay, but the artwork is the real standout. As I said before, David Finch is a god-tier artist whose work is very similar to that of comic book artist icon Jim Lee. David Finch's style encompasses a heavy use of shadows and line work, a masterful cross-hatching technique that really shows the darkness that Mark is wallowing in. He draws the character with such a powerful yet terrifying presence that really speaks to the self-loathing that Mark is in at the time. For a long time, David Finch's interpretation of the character was the first thing I thought of when it came to Moon Knight. Moon Knight was first created by writer Doug Moench and illustrated by artists Don Perlin and Al Milgrom. He would first debut in Marvel Comics Werewolf by Night number 32. He was introduced as a mercenary hired by the organization The Committee to hunt down, you guessed it, a werewolf named Jack Russell. It wouldn't be until 1980 that the character would get his own series. If you haven't put it together by now, Moon Knight is a very complex character, and it's in a lot of ways that the Disney Plus series in the MCU didn't really do justice. Moon Knight, born Mark Spector, was the son of a rabbi named Elias. He grew up on the south side of Chicago with his younger brother Randall and often bore witness to the discrimination his father would receive. Mark displayed violent tendencies as a young kid, often getting into fights and leaving his father very disappointed. Mark's tendency for violence wouldn't be truly awakened until a close family friend by the name of Rabbi Perlman was actually a Nazi, and he fled to the US where he became a serial killer targeting people within the Jewish community. Perlman would capture and attempt experiments on a young Mark. However, Mark was able to escape, and mysteriously Perlman disappeared, but the entire ordeal left Mark severely traumatized. And through that trauma, he developed dissociative identity disorder. This would result in the emergence of his two alters, Stephen Grant and Jake Lockley. More on them later. These events would also be what would cause the Egyptian moon god Khonshu to set his sights on him. As Mark grew older, his behavior became more troubled, and numerous times his father would place him in mental facilities so that he could get help. His father would soon pass away after a few years, and this would leave Mark with very conflicting feelings, as he had always viewed his father as weak for never defending himself, and Mark thought that his father was ashamed of him. Mark would eventually find another way to channel his anger by taking up boxing. Soon after that, he would enlist in the United States Marine Corps. Now, a typical military enlistment is 4 years, however, Mark would only serve in the Marine Corps for 3 years. He would be discharged after his 3rd year during a tour in Iraq for displaying disturbing behavior towards his command. And somehow, after being dishonorably discharged, he was able to join the CIA. He would have a short stint there as well. Shortly after that, he met a man named Frenchie while he was doing illegal underground fights and became a mercenary. Most of the missions he took up were in South America and Africa. While in Egypt, he met a fellow mercenary named Raoul Bushman, along with Marlene and her father, an archaeologist named Peter. Mark and Bushman decided to raid an archaeological site before Mark had a change of heart. This would spark a conflict between them where Mark was mortally wounded by the mercenary. As he lay dying at the feet of the mysterious statue in a temple, he began to hear the voice of the mysterious moon god and then realized everything in his life was preparing him for this moment. Khonshu would resurrect Mark, and in exchange he would become his avatar, his fist, his Moon Knight. So what are Moon Knight's abilities? Whatever you saw on the Disney Plus show, I'm going to need you to throw it out of your head right now. Moon Knight is a normal man who can be hurt and killed. The suit's appearance doesn't change and isn't dependent on whatever alter is in control. Moon Knight does don a white hood and a cowl. The overall suit was originally a heavy Kevlar armor, sometimes with wrappings around the forearms and the legs, which sometimes would be swapped out for Egyptian armor plates. The reason that he wears all white, Mark states that it's not for him to hide from his enemies in the shadows of the night, but he wants them to see him coming. Currently, his suit is made of a carbondanium armor, a substance that's said to be just as hard as adamantium, but with some much more flexible properties. Moon Knight's abilities are confirmed to be tied with the phases of the moon. His physical abilities during a full moon can place him roughly on the levels of a super soldier. During the events of Avengers Age of Khonshu, there was a supermoon in the sky, and Mark was able to overpower a good chunk of the Avengers, actually, which included besting Iron Fist in one-on-one combat. He also has the ability to manipulate moon rocks, which includes Thor's hammer, as Mjolnir is apparently made out of Uru metal, which is composed of ancient moon rocks. I'm just gonna say the Age of Khonshu really took some liberties with his power set. Mark's mind and mental abilities are also greatly enhanced due to his contact and being resurrected by an ancient god. We don't know the extent of it, as his dissociative identity disorder along with his tampering makes it hard to measure. He is very resistant to mental attacks and telepathy. So in anime terms, that's basically Kurenai trying to attack Itachi with a genjutsu. In terms of fighting abilities, I stated before, he's a trained boxer, along with military tactics. But over the years, he's expanded his overall repertoire and abilities with martial arts. Moon Knight doesn't have all the abilities of a Black Panther, Batman, or even a Daredevil. His style is said to lack really any grace whatsoever. His main attribute, though, is that he's relentless. He's willing to receive as many blows as it takes just to get one. He's a foe that just keeps coming. His fighting style is so brutal that martial arts master Taskmaster refuses to copy it. Another ability that he has is to pray to Khonshu for certain magical abilities such as teleportation and traversing through dimensional planes. As stated before, Moon Knight has dissociative identity disorder from trauma in his past. Now again, forget what you saw on the show. Mark uses his different alters as a means to cope and to operate as Moon Knight. Stephen Grant isn't exactly a skittish and shy man. I don't think he's British either. Stephen Grant is actually an affluent businessman and millionaire. With his calm and mild-mannered behavior, he uses his sophisticated demeanor to traverse and network through the elite. He essentially acts as the face for how Mark Spector funds his life as Moon Knight. Stephen doesn't often get involved in the violent aspects of the Avatar Khonshu, but he does carry his weight. I would say the only thing that he has in common with his show counterpart is that they're both calm and easygoing. Now let's discuss Jake Lockley. Jake is not some ultra-violent, dark aspect of Mark Spector. Mark Spector is already his own dark side. And that would confuse a lot of people who've only seen the show because that's what you would think of Jake Lockley. Jake is described as an affable dirtbag and an unbuncular scoundrel. I know I just threw a lot of words at you that don't sound too flattering, but Jake is actually well liked by the people he interacts with. He has numerous contacts and a certain charm about him that's just alluring to most people. Jake operates as a New York cab driver and spends most of his time in dive bars, strip clubs, and knows all the meetup spots in the criminal underworld. So he's essentially how Moon Knight gets his info. He doesn't mind getting his hands dirty or putting an enemy 6 feet under, but he tends to be a little bit more practical about it than Mark is. Stephen and Jake are two aspects that Mark needs to keep himself balanced. He describes both of them as the aspects of Mark Spector that people actually like. But the three of them work together to keep Mark above water and to help with his crusade. Jeff Lemire's run on the character does show the synergy between the three of them and how they come together to ultimately stop Khonshu's manipulation of them. Now there's a newer aspect to Mark's role as Moon Knight that's been introduced in the comics that's become something of a fan favorite. I'm talking about Mr. Knight. Mr. Knight is the suave, all-white three-piece wearing, white limo-riding detective. Mr. Knight is essentially the vigilante aspect of Moon Knight that regularly interacts with law enforcement and the public. As I said before, he's much more of a detective, but he's not afraid to roll those French cuffs up and get him a little red. But right now, he acts as a face for Mark and his mission. In the Age of Khonshu, the crazed Moon God manipulated Mark Spector into taking key abilities from the Avengers in order to battle the interdimensional demon known as Mephisto. Mark would soon turn on Khonshu and with the power of the Phoenix Force would assist Black Panther and the Avengers with imprisoning Khonshu within Asgard. So this brings us to the current run of Moon Knight, which I think personally is one of the best running series in comics right now. The current run of Moon Knight, which launched in 2021, is currently being written by Marvel All-Star writer Jed MacKay and is being illustrated by Alessandro Cappuccio and colorist Rochelle Rosenberg. This book is the quintessential Moon Knight experience. I seriously think that Jed MacKay understands the character more than any other writer before him. Alessandro's artwork gives us a sleek and visceral take on Moon Knight and his world, and it's all being assisted to being brought to life by the vibrant colors of Rochelle Rosenberg. The story has a perfect balance of blending Moon Knight's dark, gritty, street-level drama with the supernatural aspects and psychological horror. All of those are what make Moon Knight who he is. We see again Mark is really struggling with who he is and how he's trying to find his footing now that he's no longer associated with the Khonshu. Throughout the story, we hardly ever see him without the mask on. The majority of the panels, you'll always see him dressed as Mr. Knight. And he even says the reason is because he simply just doesn't want to look at himself. After the events of Khonshu's grab for more power, Mark's former lover Marlene revealed that they had a child together. And she told Mark that she didn't want him to come anywhere near them. Mark is essentially in a mental place right now where he believes that Mark Spector is no good to anyone. And the only good that he can bring is simply his work as Moon Knight. And since he's defected from Khonshu, he started the Midnight Mission. It's something of a hero for hire business where people can come to him for odd or paranormal type jobs. It essentially works as people coming to see Mr. Knight. He investigates, and then Moon Knight gets on the job. In the story, he's joined by his assistant Reese, a young woman who was just newly turned into a vampire by a vampire cult. She's essentially become his closest confidant and his personal assistant at the Midnight Mission. He's also joined by Reese's friend, who's an ex-Hydra agent also turned vampire named Soldier. Occasionally joining him is an old fling and ex-teammate when Mark spent his time as a West Coast Avenger, Tigra. And after all this time, he's discovered that there's another Fist of Khonshu, a man named Dr. Botter, also known as Hunter's Moon. And Hunter's Moon seems to have a greater grasp of the mystical abilities that a Fist of Khonshu can have more so than Mark. All that, and I haven't even mentioned Moon Knight's base of operations. So his base is kind of alive, sort of. Moon Knight sort of courted an interdimensional poltergeist by the name of the House of Shadows, and essentially convinced said demon ghost entity thing to become his new base of operations. In doing so, his base of operations is now essentially a haunted house capable of swallowing enemies and putting them in pocket dimensions. Honestly, there's so much I could cover in this, but I just kind of wanted to give you guys a sort of a snapshot of this character. The story right now being written by Jed MacKay is honestly a great spot for newer readers to jump in without feeling overwhelmed by any past Moon Knight lore. Moon Knight has just proven himself to be such an interesting and complex subject. His struggle as a Jewish man serving an Egyptian god, trying his best to always do the right thing yet hurting the people around him, and also struggling to see his own self-worth yet being blind to those around him who love him for who he is. There's just something really poetic about the character, and I just want to see that there is a justice to adapting him in other media in the same way that Jed MacKay has taken his care with the character. I hope you guys were able to get something out of this. This was a really fun video to do for a character that I really enjoy. And before I go, I want to give a special shout out to my dad. Without him, I would have never learned or known anything about this character. And I hope he enjoys this video too, because I know he's always starving for new Moon Knight content. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And with that, Travelers of the Night, peace.